a lot of people who might not be able. Yeah, because there's a lot of people who might not be able to make the meeting, who would be interested in the discussion.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good idea to record it.
And we've recorded the last couple
People
of
can
sessions.
catch up.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should. Yeah.
The other thing I'm sort of is Felix Padel and Yavor Tarinski.
I don't see Yavor. I
Yeah,
don't see Yavor.
hi.
Are you there?
Really?
Hi.
Hey, I can see.
Felix is here, but I don't see Yavor.
Yeah, I'm just looking now. No, you're right. Actually, yeah, I can just see Felix is here. Yeah.
Go back over there because there's less noise. Just go back over here because of the noise. So these are more of the people from the simplicity.
Hello.
Jambo.
Jambo, he says. Jambo. Yeah. This is the guy who did the Free Ojolon mural here.
Oh, right. Hi.
Yeah.
Hello. Jambo.
Yeah. So we'll go over here where there's a little less noise. But let me show you see if I can show you a little bit the space, what the space looks like. It's a beautiful space that they made out of a place that used to be a waste dump.
Oh, fantastic.
Anyhow, can you get that?
Yeah, we've got it now. Yeah.
Can I just ask Felix? We invite. Hello?
Hello, yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Of these friends that we were in touch with from India, are you aware who is going to join at this stage?
No, I have no idea, and it's quite possible nobody will.
Okay. All right.
Fair enough. Should we get started then?
Yavor is not there.
Unless anybody has any burning announcements at the start, we will get started. Okay, so just to mention, first of all, is there anybody that needs translation? I know that Sonia, you said you would be able to help with translation if that was necessary. Not quite sure who's with us that might need translation.
Jihad was going to arrange it, okay? All
okay.
Right. But he's not here yet.
No.
No, our second speaker, Yavor, is not here, okay?
No.
I've just realized that if I'm recording, I can't hand over hosting to anybody. So how do you want to do presentations?
Well,
I think we should just talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
You stay the host. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint or anything.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
But also, you can make the host can make anyone a co-host.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But when you do that, it stops the recording.
Really? Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, should we get started then? It would be nice to do a bit of a loop around, introduce ourselves briefly to start with. It worked quite nice with the nomination approach last time, didn't it? So if you're happy with that, I can nominate somebody to get started. Sarah Glynn. you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Glynn. I'm a writer and activist based in Strasbourg, and I write a weekly news review for Media News, and I also help the HDP here in Strasbourg.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I should nominate somebody. I'll nominate Felix.
Thank you. I'm an anthropologist, writer, activist, lived for years in India and worked there, but in Britain now. So I'll give a talk. I'm just going to leave the meeting and come back because something happened. So please let me back in.
Okay, I don't think Felix will be able to nominate in that case. Shall I do myself next? So I'm Steve Hunt. I'm part of the steering group of the Peace in Kurdistan Ecology Group. My main interest is in the ecological aspect of the Kurdish freedom movement. So I was involved with editing a book called Ecological Solidarity in the Kurdish freedom movement last year and contributed to that. And those of you who were with us last time will remember that we talked about that book, and Pinar Dinch and Federico Venturini also spoke last time. I suppose my main other affiliation outside of work is I'm involved with the Bristol Radical History Group. So we sort of take a history from below approach and very much about community outreach. And yeah, at the moment we're quite busy with preparing a Bristol Radical History Festival. So we have the main museum available to us here in Bristol. So that's in the past, that's been quite a large event, which should be fantastic. And at the moment, I'm just starting to scope some work on the field of ecology of agriculture in terms of Kurdish ecology. So that's very kind of new work for me at the moment. So I'm starting to work on that. I am going to nominate. Oh, actually, I've already nominated, haven't I? But I suppose I should probably. Are you back with us, Felix? I think I saw Felix back. Okay, I think I'll have to nominate somebody else again then. Oh, Estella. I'll nominate you, Estella.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm a co-founder of Peace in Kurdistan. Have worked with the Kurdish freedom movement since the start of the war in 1984, 1985, and I visited Öcalan in 1991, and really Peace in Kurdistan has grown out of the discussion with the Kurdish freedom movement, in particular Mr. Öcalan, when we were discussing how to strategize the work in globally, in particular at the time, of course, in Europe, but also in the UK where we were based, and in Germany. And yeah, so the project that we are talking about of Peace in Kurdistan and Democratic Confederalism, which you all know is our website, emerged in the last 2.5 years with the decision to discuss self-determination in relation to democratic confederalism and to build, further on a global movement which would link not just activists, but lawyers, academics, trade unionists, grassroots movements, and related organization, possibly all over the globe. And of course, our main issue at the moment that we are addressing, ecology group, is central to that. In this particular situation, we find ourselves on a global war, which is absolutely vital. We know all around the globe the water issue is one of the main central issues, linking it to anti-war and and global movements against the system. So yeah, so this is in very brief. Any questions? Some other than I ask Connor.
Hello, my name is Connor. I'm based in Scotland. My primary work is in philosophy and political theory. I was until recently a student of Jeff Miley, and I work with Estella at Peace in Kurdistan. Thank you. And so I will nominate Jeff next.
Okay, my name is Jeff Miley. I'm from the University of Cambridge, originally from California. I work on struggles for self-determination in the 21st century, what self-determination can and must mean. I work very closely with Peace in Kurdistan. I'm here in Kenya, working on a grassroots liberation campaign, which among other things has engaged in a series of educational murals that pointing out the cause of freedom for Ojulan and trying to raise consciousness about the role of the Kenyan state in the abduction of Ojulan. I nominate Sonia.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I work in politics, particularly in women's rights and in ecology for Rojhelat. I'm a representative for Rojhelat in the ecology meetings. At the moment, we're working on deforestation in Rojhelat and the destruction of marshlands and swamp and the impact that has on the Kurdish communities in the area and how that's also affecting forced environmental change, forced genocide. I nominate Umit.
انگلیسی چاک نیه
تشتكني من بترجمة تخوازي لسر خوت بشوق بكنك بيجتو كارتشي وبري تكتبوا لناو كاري كردواري تشيكيت
على كردستان شیم کردووە پێشتر یانێ
بلى
هذا كردي بلمبت
أذا حبكيت
هذا من أميدم خلقي ڕۆژهەڵاتی کوردستانم لەوێ کۆتاییم بەزانکۆ چتم لەوێ هێناوە بەڵام ئێستا دۆ چەند مانگێکە لێرەم 6 مانگە لە بریتانیام لە وەستێ لە ژیم پێشتر کاریشم چالاکی بووە لە کومەیتی بۆحرانە چالاکی ژینگە پارێزی شتە و
So he's from Rojhelat. He's had to leave Rojhelat because of his ecological work. He has previously worked in environmental sector and voluntary work. He's now in England.
بەڵێ سپاس.
And then I'll nominate someone for him. Shall we say Nick Hildyard?
Let me undo the mute, sorry. Hi, I'm Nick Hildyard. I work with a small solidarity and mutual learning group called the Corner House, which is in the UK. I've worked since the late 90s with Estella and others on the Kurdish issue, and particularly on issues around large-scale infrastructure projects in the Kurdish regions of Turkey, but also Iraq and Syria, and particularly dams. Corner House is its approach to these issues is very much based around the idea of reclaiming and extending the commons, which we see as being not just about common property rights, but about more the everyday struggle in all spheres of life to ensure the collective right of all to survival. I've got to nominate someone else, haven't I? How about Stephen? Or have you already gone?
I've already been actually, Nick, thanks.
So who have I got? Who's left? Sarah, have you been? No.
Sarah's been.
Say Sally or Les?
Les.
Yeah, I'm a this ecology meeting. Okay. Well, which I sent you actually.
Can only see limited number of you actually, so I haven't quite worked out how to do that.
Okay. Are you with us, Les?
Someone else nominate for me, please.
Les, you with us? You able to introduce
Les,
yourself?
yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, you can see my name, and I came to these issues initially through the campaign against criminalizing communities 2 decades ago, with the strong impetus from the Kurdish freedom movement in Britain. And then that led to a series of seminars in person, yes, on self-determination, questioning the category of the nation as the basis for self-determination. And then another connection through my recent research on agroecology movements in South America, where they're closely linked with the concepts of solidarity, economy, and food sovereignty, and so have possible resonances with democratic autonomy. I'm thinking about how to make those connections. I'll leave it at that.
Nominate someone.
Next.
Yeah. Who's left?
Sally.
Yeah, am I? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, and I just like Liz, I got involved with Stella in the campaign against criminal communities, and obviously, I think people have mentioned it as well that the terrorism laws in Britain, there are so many of them really. After Terrorism Act 2000, we had 9 or 10 of them, and an immense impact on Kurdish community, Tamil community, Baloch community, particularly in listing. So part of our project also is the demanding a delisting of PKK. And recently I was involved in reviewing 20 years of terrorism laws in Britain and the impact on the communities and the tremendous numbers of injustices because of these laws. My current interest is really in Sudan and the democratic movement in Sudan, because it ties up with democratic modernity, because Sudanese people and resistance groups are really fighting for democracy against a military dictatorship in Sudan. So that's my current interest. And also ecological issues come into Sudan as well, just like climate change, ecology, ever present. Nobody talks about it, but it's there. They got flooding problems, they got deforestation, they got land issues. So that's my current interest. And by the way, I'm connected to Nairobi because I lived in Nairobi and taught in Nairobi for a long time. Okay.
Very interesting. Very interesting, the Nairobi connection. We'll have to talk about that more.
Yeah. Uhuru. Interested in Mau Mau history as well, because that's just been written out,
Definitely. We're trying to get them to remember that actually. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sela. Is there anybody else who's not introduced themselves so far? I think we're all done. I don't think Yavor Tarinski is with us yet, or say otherwise if you're with us, Yavor. Has anybody got have means to?
I just emailed him.
Maybe all right, fantastic.
But I don't know if he's responding.
No, okay, fair enough. I don't know. We can do no more.
Yeah.
So Connor and myself are going to chair the discussion today. I've noticed that I've lost my connection briefly once. I'm really hoping that that doesn't happen, but hopefully things can tick over if I do lose connection again. So this is our third Peace in Kurdistan Ecology network meeting. So we're I think the idea of this group really is to partly have these conversations, partly to learn from each other, particularly around Kurdish ecology, but then thinking about the links to the wider project of democratic confederalism. It's partly about building bridges and having conversations across social movements and compatible social movements.
All right. Well, maybe Connor, can you take over? Seems to be frozen.
I can, though I don't believe it was circulated publicly, though Steve and I prepared a small agenda. And at this point in time, there was going to be a brief summary about updating about the groups that have been made, this groups platform that has been made for this ecology group, and the reading lists. And unfortunately, I don't have much information to share about this. So I cannot give that part of the update. So if while we can come back to that once Steve reconnects, unless anyone else has anything that they would like to share or say at this point, we could just turn to the discussion portion and have Felix give his presentation.
Presentation.
Okay. So Felix, if you are ready,
presentation, yeah.
you briefly, what was that, Jeff? Anything?
No, I was just saying presentation, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Felix already briefly introduced himself, though I'll give a slightly longer introduction to him and then let him speak, and then there'll be a portion for questions and open discussion afterwards. So Felix Padel is an anthropologist who has written several books and taken part in several key movements in solidarity with the Adivasis, or the tribal people in India, where he is taught at a number of academic institutions. In addition, he is a patron of the Peace in Kurdistan campaign and a longtime supporter of the Kurdish freedom movement. So Felix will speak on the subject of social ecology, industrialization, and militarization in India. And he will highlight a number of people's movements in India against forced industrialization and the connections between mining and arms manufacture / militarization. So I will now turn it over to Felix. Felix, you are on mute at the moment.
Thanks, Connor. Brilliant. Okay. I'm just going to go for it then. And I'm going to speak for, I'll try to speak just for 15 minutes. There's a huge amount to summarize. And at first I made a PowerPoint for this talk, but it's much better if you can see pictures to understand what are the mountains, forests, mines, and people. But in this time, it's just not possible. So I'm going to show a few books as I speak. You probably all know, there's a very, very large number of diverse movements in India. Probably most recently, you've heard of the farmers' movement. There are also many workers' movements, and literally hundreds of movements by local people against forced industrialization, which to me is something very under-conceptualized. So we'll come back to that, like, what is industrialization? I also want to try and choose what is relevant for people working on Kurdish issues. So the mining issue may not be that issue, but in terms of extractivism of oil and other things, water especially, it'll be very relevant. So people we call Adivasis, or tribal people, and these names, these words are always contentious and always debatable. So according to the population surveys of India, there's over 100 million scheduled tribal people of India. And if you look at the issue of big dams alone, at least over 25 million Adivasis have been displaced from their homes by forced industrialization, but sorry, by big dams alone, because big dams are the biggest displacer. Sometimes some of the biggest dams in India have displaced over 250,000 people. So this is something obviously very relevant for India, where the big dams in Turkey have had huge impacts on Syria and Iraq and the whole of Kurdistan, really. If you look at a map of India, a lot of the central India is counted as tribal areas. And if you look at a map of tribal India, where the tribal people live, it's on the whole very similar to the map of where the best forest remains in India, also where the best minerals are in India, and also where the Maoist conflict is. So I'll come back to that a bit. I would say you can't understand the mining situation in India without understanding a bit the Maoist situation, and vice versa. You can't understand the Maoist conflict without understanding the mining situation. The displacement by big dams and mines and factories, when people are displaced from the land, they become resettled, often lose their jobs, lose their cultural roots, because their identity is very linked up with the land and the use of forest resources. So I and others often talk about the process as one of cultural genocide. Okay, and yes, in terms of who the tribal people are, this is by an Adivasi colleague. Whose country is it anyway? Untold stories of the indigenous peoples of India. A lot of people would react against that idea. India has indigenous peoples, and it's controversial to begin with. And if you see the cover, it's looking over the shoulder of an armed policeman. And this is my first book, which deals with a tribe in Orissa called the Kons in the east of India, and they number about 1 million. And the idea, the tribal people have to be sacrificed, or their well-being has to be sacrificed for the sake of development, is a very common theme in India. So the work I in a way became well known for is to do with aluminium. And this is the book that had a huge impact in India in stopping a bauxite mine. So Out of This Earth, East India Adivasis and the Aluminium Cartel. So one of the themes here is that aluminium, it's actually, this is actually an anthropology of the whole aluminium industry worldwide, looked at in various countries in terms of the bauxite is the key ore for aluminium, and countries with bauxite like Guyana, Jamaica, many countries, often the independence was delayed for as much as 10 years in the case of Guyana, by battles over the bauxite. But in terms of the factories, the refineries and smelters, one of the main reasons for building big dams worldwide has been to give hydropower as well as water to aluminium factories. And many people don't know this, so I would really want to look more at Turkey and the big dams that have been built, and whether there is any link with aluminium in particular. Because another thing about aluminium is it's very, very, very closely linked with the arms industry. That's there, as an aluminium specialist said in the American government in 1951, no war can be fought and brought to a successful conclusion without using and destroying vast quantities of aluminum. So in India, some of the bauxite mines and factories are located next to arms factories where they make military aeroplanes. So in terms of the militarization, is at two levels. One is within all these mining areas of India, there is an absolutely vast increase in the number of armed police and the atrocities they're committing. But also the minerals that are being brought out, and the steel factories and aluminium factories are the highest value customers. It's making weapons for war. So the history of the aluminium mines and factories in India and the struggles against them are very complex. But what this book does is speak from the point of view of these Adivasi movements, really taking on the aluminium industry. At one point, the people were asking the head of police, the police were saying, you people are against development. Why don't you want development? Don't you want schools? Don't you want hospitals? And the people were saying, what kind of development is it to destroy a mountain for 30 years mining? And who is the profit going to? Tell us how many missiles and warplanes you're going to make from the bauxite in a mountain. And of course, the police was shocked. He didn't even know that, there's that link with the arms industry. And that book had an impact in stopping a mine by a company called Vedanta, which was based in London at that point, and getting finance from London, and saving the mountain Niamgiri, which has very, very special tribal people. And this is how the women dress of that tribe. They're called the Dongriakons. So these people had a movement with solidarity across the left political parties and with environmentalists, which is very unusual in India and really helped, and with certain government people who stuck their neck out, and many, many different kinds of people. So that was a successful movement. But near Niamgiri, Vedanta had already started an aluminium refinery, very, very polluting, and they are bringing the bauxite from another mountain, which they are mining. So I had two friends from Orissa who are going to join today, but they're traveling to another movement today, so they can't probably join. And that is a movement called the Mali Parbat movement. So they sent out a few recent photographs, which themselves are quite inspiring, and a 15-minute film, which we can share afterwards if you like. So I'm keeping it incredibly short. If you understand the aluminium industry, in Orissa, the British in the 1920s understood the quality bauxite there could be used for making aluminium, which was a new metal then. And they understood they'd have to make big dams, which were made from the 1950s, railways to get the product to the ports, and the World Bank paid for them through loans, and so on and so on. But also, especially what's needed is coal mining. And the World Bank in India has given vast loans for coal mining. And in a way, what you see is the World Bank has got Orissa, of all the states in India, into the worst debt to pay for an infrastructure for mining. And Nick Hildyard's here. We've had meetings on this kind of thing. So the infrastructure for mining then allowed foreign investment to come in, and just the scale of destruction is happening really beyond what can be easily said. The iron and steel industry is even more, and this is a book by that same Adivasi friend, Mission Surrender, a war over natural resources in India. And he's talking here, Surrender Forest is a place for good quality iron ore. So about 50 different companies are taking over the people there. I've just seen one of my friends called Rajan is trying to join now. So that would be great if you can let him in. So if you look at the steel industry in particular, if you look at the history of UK and then US and then USSR and then Mao's China with the Great Leap Forward, the steel has always been seen as the sorry, Raja is saying to the host, please let me in. That might be you now, Connor, I'm not sure. Sorry, I lost my thread there a bit.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't believe it is me. When I look at the participant list, I believe it is still listing Sonia as the host.
Sonia, can you let him in? His name is Raja Raman. Well, while you're trying to let Raja in, I'll carry on a bit. The steel industry in particular, and some of the conflicts over iron ore mining and steel plants, some of the worst affected areas by that are the worst affected areas by the Maoist conflict. And I think this is the best book by a colleague in Delhi University, Nandini Sundar, The Burning Forest, India's War in Bastar. Bastar is this tribal heartland of eastern central India. And to understand the Maoist conflict, again, would be, it's an hour's talk in itself, really. And I would say for myself, I do not really support the Maoist conflict. I would agree with them on many things, but one thing I would differ is in using the name Mao itself. Unlike, for example, the Kurdish movement, which doesn't use the name Maoist or even Leninist now in its title. And another is that, well, Mao himself, the Great Leap Forward, was imposing steel production. So if they're supporting movements that are opposing iron ore mining and steel production in India, it raises a question whether they're sincere in that, and whether they, I suppose, with all of the Marxist parties in India, of which there are quite a lot, at times they're allies in movements, but at times also their own, there's a kind of ideological belief in industrialization as a necessary stage of development. So in a way, Marxists are often ambiguous and allies for a lot of these movements. And the Maoists, when they get control of an area in India, very often they undermine the traditional leadership. So, and it's also like a kiss of death in terms of the response to the Maoists by the military is so out of proportion. It's, that the extent of violence by the military by the armed police is unbelievable. There's tens of thousands of Adivasis in jail on sometimes false, sometimes one doesn't know, charges of being Maoists. And the other thing is, I suppose, as the industrialization of these areas has proceeded, it's full spectrum dominance, big roads, and it becomes very, very hard for the Maoists to continue operating in areas that they once controlled. This is another book by Gladstone called Endless Cry in the Red Corridor, where he's equally critical, I suppose, of the armed police and the Maoists. So this is something many of my comrades in India would agree with this, many would disagree. So it's very contentious, but I'm saying in a context where I support wholeheartedly the PKK, I don't feel in the same way about Maoists, even though often we'd have a common enemy. So maybe I'll just leave that at that for the moment. And coming back to the iron and steel industry, one of the biggest, it came to a head in 2006 with a police firing in a place called Kalinganagar in India, where 12 Adivasis were shot dead by police who were opposing a Tata Steel plant. And if you know, Tata Steel is very much linked to the British economy. And we fought Vedanta through understanding the economic. Hello? Am I going too fast? Okay, I'll carry on and maybe try and speak for another just 5 to 7 minutes, if that's okay. One of the forms that police atrocities takes in India, especially in tribal areas, is what we call false encounters, which are quite similar to false flags that you might talk about in Turkey. And a false encounter is where they kill people often in cold blood and stage it as a genuine fight out. And obviously Central India isn't their only area. Kashmir conflicts you all will have heard of. And maybe not so much Northeast India, the state of Manipur. In Northeast India, the state of Manipur is said to be the most militarized state in India. And even the Supreme Court in India recognized over 1,500 fatal encounters were staged encounters, false encounters by the police. And there, the issue is, it's very much kind of to do with tribal identity, but also the issue of oil extraction as well as mineral extraction, and big dams are very common issues there. But in central India, it's become, one of the worst conflicts in India in terms of the impact on people's lives. That, like 20, 30 years ago, when I would travel all over India, one could go freely to any tribal any tribal village. Now there is just such suspicion. Many villages are divided into the Maoist or the police side. The police has employed tens of thousands of Adivasis to fight the Maoist Adivasis. Then when people surrender, they become manipulated. It's so complex. And things like that you will recognize very much from what has happened to Kurdish villages in Turkey, with the village guards. They're similar to what we call the SPOs, the special police officers in India. So I wanted to mention too that last month I published with my colleague Madhvika Gupta an issue of this journal seminar, which is about, we edited an issue on extractivism, indigeneity, and self-determination. And for anybody who wants to understand this more deeply, there are many articles there by Adivasi friends and others. And Raja, I don't know whether Raja's been admitted now, but his own article in that is an interview with a shaman in Niyamgadi, and also a young Kond boy who was at this world's biggest boarding school called KISS, Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, where they are really brainwashed, I would say. 30,000 children in one school from all the tribes in Orissa and beyond. And then he'd been part of the local Mali Parbat movement, which, if Raja is here, he can maybe just speak about it a little bit. And this interview with this boy, having been part of this elite school, but then very alienated from his own society, and then part of his own society's movement against the bauxite mining, then he's sent to jail. And the interview is with him, how he's comparing the jail with the big boarding school. And very like this, there are many grassroots voices there that one really opens our eyes to what's happening in different parts of India. I suppose this, for me, is part of a broader program of, this was my third book, Ecology Economy, Quest for a Socially Informed Connection, where looking at different ideas of what an economy is. Like in an Adivasi economy, exchange is always fair. One person isn't trying to make a profit out of the other people. And the words ecology and economy come from the same root of oikos, meaning ancient Greek for house. So the logic or the norms of making a household economy, or the economy of the state. And I love the diagram, in a way, summarizes it, where one half of the leaf is money and one is leaf. And the contradiction between that, like all these movements are termed anti-development movements in India. But, they all say, we need development in our own hands. We need education in our own hands. We need self-determination in that sense. And this is the most recent book in English by my friend Gladstone, Adivasis and Their Forest. So for Kurdistan, this would bring up questions of whose is the forest, whose is the land, whose is the water, and whose is the oil below the land? Who makes decisions how we sell our industrial products, and how we restrain how we use it, I suppose. One of the other things about Adivasis is that they have very strong democratic traditions of their own, where people sit in a circle and no decision is taken without a consensus. Means you don't have voting, and if 51% if one party gets 51%, they win. No, decisions have to be made by consensus. Everybody has to agree. And, this is, of course, people often say it works in a small scale. It can't work in a big scale society. But there was Jaipal Singh Munda was one of the Adivasi leaders at independence, where he really confronted Nehru at one point, who started the industrialization in Adivasi areas process. And Nehru was saying, we must bring democracy to the tribal areas. And Jaipal was saying, you cannot bring democracy to the tribal areas. You have to learn democratic ways from them. They're the most democratic people on earth. And I feel, a lot of solidarity with Kurdish issues there, because I think, the Kurdish in Rojava and so on through Öcalan, the Kurds have formulated what is one of the best democratic models on earth. So I would love to see solidarity between these movements and Kurdish people. I would also mention Ecuador, because my colleague Malvika is there now, and I think the anti-mining or anti-extractive movements there are much more cohesive than in India, where the divide and rule policy has become so ingrained that any project, when it starts, it splits the local tribal people into those for the project and anti the project. So I hope that has been coherent. I've tried to cover too much ground in a short time, but questions, please, later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix. Yeah, I mean, I think that, your words there about solidarity between the Kurdish movement and the Adivasi movement, I think that's, very much the sorts of discussions that we're interested in having. What I suggest is that...
Yavor is here now.
Yes,
Yavor is here now.
Hi, Yavor. Yeah. So, what I suggest is that if we have any immediate questions for Felix, maybe we could put those questions now. And also, you mentioned, I think Rajan is with us now. I don't know, without putting you on the spot, did you want to pick up on any of Felix's points if you caught those from a few minutes ago?
Raja, are you there?
Hey, Felix, I just joined a couple of minutes ago. Hello, everyone. And
hello.
Johar, Adivasi land in India.
Johar, can you show your face just for a moment? Hi.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Great. Yeah.
So it's a
maybe you better switch your video off because you're rotting. You're breaking. Well, while Raja is paused, I'd just say he traveled today to a coal mining area in Chhattisgarh, where there's movement against a big mine by Adani, the most powerful mining company in India right now.
Oh, wow.
Can you speak maybe with your camera off, Raja, just for a moment?
There should be cross solidarity, and it's really vital because in Adivasi lands is not much different from, as far as I've come to learn from people and reading, are not very different in the Kurdish land struggles. So I'll sort of stop there. But then, since Felix is there, we can ask any questions or anything like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan.
I'd like to ask Felix a question. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Les.
Okay. Yes, thanks. That's fascinating. I'd like to put a specific question about what this means for solidarity efforts from the global north in support of the resistance against the plunder in Adivasi areas or anywhere in the world, but especially India, because that's the topic here. I mean, there may be millions of people who at least remember the campaign against Vedanta, which seems to have been a rare success in the big picture. And that's an opportunity on which future efforts can build, because it's a familiar reference point. But I'm thinking that to the extent that people remember it or identify with that campaign, they may have come away thinking, well, this was an evil company which was stopped in its tracks, job done, when, of course, as we know, it was exceptional only because it was the most high-profile, broadly supported campaign, including some support from within state agencies, including the Environment Ministry. But it's really the exception that proves the rule, in the sense that the entire global North economy depends on that plunder, by Vedanta and similar companies which are less well known in the North. So I'm just wondering, firstly, what kind of political education would be worthwhile and feasible so that people can be pushed beyond seeing Vedanta as an exception, to see it as the rule, as indicating something about what's wrong with the economies in the global North. And then what practical support can be given to the resistance, by whatever capacities we can muster in the global North.
Thank you very much, Lev, for that question.
Because he
In the
Vedanta, just one
Hello?
second. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, just 1 second. I just wanted to ask a question. He mentioned the last part of what he said was about how do we help the resistance. And in so doing, we also have to ask the question, what problems, if we're honest, do the resistance face in self-organizing? And in that sense, if we do understand what problems of self-organization they face, then perhaps we can start working on strengthening those weaknesses, as opposed to just throwing more resources at it, trying to strengthen it so that when we do put resources on it, it floats rather than sink. And so if I could just add that part onto his question and allow you to continue. Sorry for the disruption.
Thank you, Sonia. Yeah, it's very, very hard to summarize how we succeeded there. It was such an unlikely combination of such often conflicting and very divergent groups that did give success. And for example, just on the battles we had over for and against the role of NGOs in that movement, one could speak an hour about that. So contentious, and many other aspects too. And as you said, Lev, we succeeded with Niyamgiri, but in 100 other cases we're failing. And I think, maybe we should bring Raja in a little bit more to talk about what might succeed, how much the Mali Parbat movement is succeeding. But one thing I wanted to draw attention to is, like you said, we stopped our coal mining. We deindustrialized our coal mining, a lot of our steel manufacture and so on. All our aluminium factories closed because it's much cheaper to get other countries to produce for us. So in that sense, we've outsourced our steel production, our metal production. And the world economy, at the heart of it, is the arms industry, which people are not usually talk about, and both the mining and the arms industry, they spread corruption, they spread war and conflict, and they spread disinformation too, which makes it very hard. In terms of getting the media on board occasionally, which we did with Vedanta, it's a real struggle to get an article in mainstream newspapers. So, not easy to answer your questions, but very, very important questions we have to keep answering, and maybe we can come back to it later.
Can I ask a question as well?
Please, Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm
And
really
then Sarah,
curious
Sarah has a question as well.
Okay. I'm really curious about your point about this kind of comparison between the Maoists and the PKK. If you could elaborate a little bit more about what you think are the similarities and the differences between the two movements. I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah, great. Again, maybe you should ask Raja of this, because he's living in a Maoist area and has to deal with them on a daily basis. Similar is that, you know, women are there under arms and often very motivated to take up arms, especially when a family member or something has been tortured and killed by police. And Arundhati Roy has written very powerfully about that. And Arundhati Roy positioned herself at one point as making quite a comparison between the Kurds, the Kurdish movement, and the Maoists. The criticisms I have, I suppose I would just repeat what I tried to summarize before. One is their use of the term Maoist brings in a kind of almost unquestioning image of Mao as benevolent, when I personally understand him as having betrayed a lot of his comrades and so on. And also the Great Leap Forward remains very little questioned. I'd love to know whether Maoist cadres in the forest are exposed to what the Great Leap Forward was and did. It's often very much forgotten. And then it's the strategy. Sometimes Maoists are fairly restrained in who and how they target, because they know the reprisals are out of all proportion. If they kill police or kill a politician, the reprisals in the villages around are beyond words, just so savage. And then, of course, where the police have committed those atrocities, then they can get more recruits for the Maoists. So it's in that sense another vicious circle. And when they stage an attack on, for example, the Nalco mine, the biggest mine, bauxite mine in India, they kill security guards, they get explosives, but they don't necessarily try to stop the mine functioning. So are they implicit? Are they not, you know, is it implicit that they believe in the same model of industrialization as the capitalists they're fighting? And finally, they don't try and, as far as I know, ever kill the actual capitalists themselves, the heads of the mines or factories. So, I mean, again, it's a hugely complex task, and I think some words from Raja might be good here.
So as far as I would say people, those who are Adivasi people, those who are in the Maoist cadres, they wouldn't know that they would, or most of them largely would not even know the name Mao. But then there has been a traditional way of how indigenous communities has resisted and fought for their lands. So if that has been termed as Maoism or Naxalbari or any other movement, that is a kind of classification that the state sort of puts on the tribal people. But then there has been always more than, even during the colonized period, the indigenous people have resisted with their bows and arrows and arms in whichever way it has been possible. But today, largely in contemporary India, or maybe in the last 30, 40 years, people have come to call it as Maoism. That's how I would sort of see it. Because it becomes easier for the state to sort of tag them as Maoist and anti-national and anti-social and so on and so forth. But this way of resisting land, this way of protecting their cultural autonomy has always existed amongst indigenous people. So that I think has to be respected, and that I think is the most important point, at least in terms of how, if we are in some ways trying to bridge a similarity between the indigenous led resistant movement and the Rojava or the Kurdish PKK movement. That's one. And the second thing about in terms of the global north, the question that came up, I was just wanting to say this. Yes, it's very important that the Vedanta battle has shown really, say, for example, in Mali Parbat. So on April 19th and 20th, it's the Mali Parbat is a bauxite mine where the festival is going to happen, like how it happens every year in Niyamgiri. So it has become a hope for a lot of other Adivasi movements in Orissa and Eastern India in terms of how the Dongriakon fought the Vedanta. And also not to deny that all these, like Felix said, that the global north has outsourced mining and steel production and aluminium and weapon resources for weapon to other, so quote unquote developing or developed nations. But I think we need a broader critique of development unless the global north starts questioning itself in terms of what development is. I think that is at the heart of the thing, and how colonization is being redistributed again in the name of development, or say post-development society. I think I would stop there.
Very good point. Yeah.
Sorry, I think we've got two questions. Can we ask Sarah Glynn, because I know she's been waiting a long while, and then after that it's Nick Hildyard.
Hi.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the question about what is development, because that's obviously really crucial. But I wanted to just ask a question about the organization and international organization, because these are international companies, and this isn't the only place that these same companies are polluting and exploiting. And I was wondering what links are made. There's presumably protest movements in other places. So what forms of international links there are protesting against these companies?
Just very briefly on that, it's a really great question. A lot of these companies were fighting Indian, primarily Indian, but one of them, Vedanta, for example, came, so it controlled the whole copper mining economy of Zambia. And my colleague, Samarendra Das, who I wrote the book with, he went to Zambia, he did a lot of work there, and he discovered, basically they were showing two completely different, on the official accounts, they were showing they were making a loss, but in the private hidden accounts, they were making a vast profit. And Samarendra found a speech where Anil Agarwal, the head of Vedanta, was boasting to a business meeting in India how he had fooled the Africans and how he had got a huge profit. And when Samarendra translated that and it went viral in Zambia, it had vast repercussions there. So certainly over Zambia, UK and India and a few other countries, this anti-Vedanta campaign really had a very big impact. In terms of Adani, where Raja is now, the enemy is Adani. And Adani, if any of you know, it's taking over coal mines in Indonesia and Australia, but it controls 2/3 of the ports in India. It's the main underwriter financer of the BJP government. Vast new coal mines. It's a very, very different and specifically Indian enemy. While Tata Steel, it's also an old Indian company. It owned Land Rover, Jaguar, and British Steel, Chorus. So yes, our movements, and Nick Hildyard has again I've shared meetings with him where we're looking at the finances, how mining is financed. You can't really fight a company unless you understand a bit about how the complicated economy of aluminium works. So thank you for that question. And it's only the most superficial of answers, but thank you.
Thank you, Felix. Would you be happy to take one more question from Nick, and then I think we'll move on and
yes, absolutely.
Yavor to speak, and then we can come back to the discussion kind of later. I'm just going to keep my camera off for a moment, so I seem to lose my connection. So, yeah, that would be great. So if you have a question, Nick, please.
Well, I had a bit more than a question. I had a sort of comment on the issue of development, which I think is absolutely central. I mean, is it okay to comment or
Absolutely.
Carry on. Yeah.
Because I mean, I mean, I absolutely agree with Felix that this is, I mean, what one means by development and what development actually constitutes today is absolutely central, not just to issues of dams and coal mining and aluminium or whatever, but also, you know, shifting of I mean, logistics, these super corridors that are being built across India and around the world and so on and so forth. And the issue of the actual challenge to notions of development was really central to my recollection in the very early days of what one might call the anti-dam movement in India and elsewhere. I mean, it was the central issue, and it has somewhat sloughed off the agenda. I mean, not least because of as the challenge to dams has become picked up by Western environmentalists and others, the social issues have been, or the political economy issues have been somewhat set to one side in a rather fruitless attempt to get the ear of so-called decision makers, particularly at the World Bank and places like that. But I mean, I think it's essential that it is put back on the agenda front and foremost, and that's a call also to the Kurdish movement. I mean, I noticed that the last water forum, in a Mesopotamian water forum, you know, was proposing small dams as a way forward in the water crisis. And I'd just like to make a few points here, because for me, I see dams as very much in line with the historic processes of what I would call enclosure. That is enclosure of the commons. I mean, in Britain, it started with land being grabbed from community-held land being grabbed and privatized, mainly for production of sheep and so on and so forth. But it's about more. It's a much more than just taking over land or displacing people through reservoirs or whatever. I mean, enclosure inaugurates a completely new ecological order. I mean, it scoffs at the notion that there's some parts of the environment have to be set aside to secure a community's subsistence. It completely transforms the environment into a resource, into so many chips that can be cashed in as commodities and handed out as political favors and so on and so forth. It completely changes who controls those resources, and it assigns the control largely to actors outside of the community. I mean, most obviously land, and particularly the best quality land, is concentrated in proportionally fewer and fewer hands. And with dams, where you have the enclosure of water, it generates scarcity and conflict. Large-scale irrigated plantations, for example, deny water to local farmers who work outside a plantation system or irrigation system, a commercial irrigation system. So it cordons off those aspects of the environment that are deemed useful to the encloser, generally capitalists, but also state capitalists, as in China today. And in doing so, it reorganizes society to meet the overriding demands of the market. It demands that production and exchange conform to rules that reflect the supply and demand and so on. So it redefines communities. It redefines the reference points by which people are valued. It ushers in a completely new ecological order, and with it a completely new political order. And it changes how the environment is managed, by whom and for whose benefit. So in opposing or critiquing contemporary notions of development, one isn't just looking at a technocratic critique. It's not just a question of, oh, well, let's have these dams with a few more social and environmental standards. I think to really understand the impact, the environmental impacts and the political economy impacts of development of these large-scale infrastructures, one needs to understand that the technologies are doing more than just blocking a river. They are ushering in completely new ecological, social, and political orders, which are inimical to the collective right of all to survival. And that's why I think, you know, the issue of development, which today is just primitive accumulation writ large, has to be put at the center of any critique.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Can I come back on a couple of those points, Nick? Really well put. I wanted to mention, for one, somebody most of you may not have heard of, a socialist in India called Lohiya, who in the 1950s really confronted Nehru over dams. And maybe he was one of the first people to really speak about the danger of dams in the 1950s. And especially for Kurdish solidarity, I'd like to mention the Samajwadi Jan Parishad, which, a bit like HDP, I consider one of the best political parties I know. And it reveres three people: Marx, Gandhi, and Lohiya. And that's in distinction to a lot of the Marxist parties in India don't talk about Lohiya much. But he has a kind of, as an indigenous socialist, he had a different model. The other thing I'd like to mention, what another comment mentioned, in again response to what Nick is saying, is, you know, that here in Britain, when we hosted in Scotland COP26, so many of the solutions that are offered are not real solutions at all. They're not, even I believe, dams are called green energy because they are not burning fossil fuels, but and a lot of the big dams in India are getting CDM, clean development mechanism, as it were, carbon trading, and very few people realize that. It's wind and solar, again, are not as green as they pretend when you look at the land grabs in India for them, when you look at the rare earth minerals involved. The electric car isn't a solution. But what are the worst enemies that are not being talked about? It's the arms industry itself that is vastly polluting, as are the wars, and the mining industry. They're just really so often removed from the discourse. So I wanted to really highlight that point. Thank you for those points, Nick, and everybody.
Estella.
I will be very brief. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Very brief. In context of what you just said, given the fact that we are today in a world war situation, right, with powers, you know, rearranging political stuff right around the world, with full-scale threat to nuclear war, etc., etc. The whole, you know, situation needs to be put in the context of today's crisis, right? So the political analysis to put this into it, I think is absolutely vital, okay? Nothing can be explained without that, because we don't know what role is going to China and India going to play really in this new form, with the imposing of sanctions on Russia, etc., etc. I mean, it's a full-scale, full-blown international war. And I really do think we need to discuss this urgently at some point, okay? Because we cannot just talk about individual campaigns on dams and this and that, okay? Just briefly, okay?
Thank you.
I'd like to second Estella's emphasis there on putting it in the context of the global crisis. But I also, is it possible that we could go on to Yavor? Because I'm running out of battery on my phone here. And I don't know how long I'm going to be able to be in the meeting. But I'd really love to hear what Yavor.
Yeah, I think we should go on to Yavor now, if that's okay with everyone. We can come back to the discussion afterwards if there are further questions.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Yavor, if you are ready, we will begin. I will just give a brief introduction for you, if that's all right, and then I'll turn it over to you. So Yavor Tarinski is an activist and independent researcher, having participated in various social movements around the Balkans. He is currently a member of TRIS, or the Transnational Institute of Social Ecology, an editor at the Greek libertarian platform Avtolexi, and a bibliographer at Agora International. He's the author of over 5 books on direct democracy and social ecology, the most recent of which is entitled Concepts for a Democratic and Ecological Society, published by Zero Books, which will be available in bookstores next month in May. He will speak, I believe, on his personal experience of attempts at democratic organizing along social ecology lines in the Balkans. Yavor, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful conversation so far. There was very important points noted, and I hope that I will also be able to contribute somehow with what I'm about to say. I hope you're hearing me good. Everything is okay, right? I am from the Balkans. My main experience is from movements and grassroots groups and social movements from Bulgaria and from Greece. These are 2 countries that are at the hearts of Balkans. They are next to each other, but in the same time, due to historical developments, they have been for many decades situated into opposite camps, Bulgaria being into the Soviet camp and Greece being into the so-called Western camp. So the contexts are very different, although as I have come to understand, the problems that the social movements and especially the libertarian autonomous collectives are very similar at a certain extent. So I will try to focus on some of the conclusions that I have reached to during the years of my personal participation in such collectives. I am from Bulgaria, so there was my first involvement with the radical autonomous type of politics. I began in a more like a traditionally anarchist groups, and I slowly get in a way disenchanted with this classical class-centered politics. And one of the things that we did was we created a social center, a free, open, self-managed social center called Adelante that made a lot of changes in the local political scene. And then in Greece, I was in various groups, and currently I'm also in one group called Aftenergia, which is a social ecologist-centered group with a lot of emphasis on the Zapatistas and the Kurdish groups. So one thing that I have seen in both countries is that often these libertarian autonomous groups are very self-centered. So they tend to care a lot of internal issues, be it in Bulgaria or in Greece. And while in Greece, the movement is very huge, so you can still have this illusion that the outreach that these inner discussions have, it's somehow much wider. The limits of this are very evident in Bulgaria, where due to the Soviet past, people are very much cynical and have made a step away from politics because due to the ideological mantle of socialism, in countries like Bulgaria, the political system claimed that it works towards the creation of a stateless society, a classless society, while simultaneously creating a very powerful bureaucratic structure that was very elite-based. So these people were very disenchanted. They were very much away from anything political. And when small collectives were engaged in these endless debates and inner dialogues, you saw how it was much more of an activist clubhouse and there was no influence on society. So one of the things that me and people in this social center of Adelante we did was that we adopted an approach that I'm calling mapping and strengthening social counterpowers. In a sense, we abandoned like this type of anarchist vanguardism that many anarchist groups, for example, can tend to have, that they seek, that they place a lot of emphasis on the organization and of activities of like anarchist groups, etc. And instead, we were very much interested into what we call common people are doing, what segments of societies are doing that have like socio-ecological or direct democratic elements. So in the early 2010 to 2014, especially with the movement of the squares that was taking place all over Europe and in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, etc., there were actually many people that were not knowledgeable of anarchism or of other radical theories or ideologies, but they were nonetheless influenced by these global movements, and they were self-organizing. And it was very interesting for us and very important that we were mapping such experiences, and then when possible we were trying to engage with them and to support these elements that we saw in them, that they were positive, that they were democratic, that they were ecological, and to try with our participation to strengthen these elements. For example, there is in the countries of Eastern Europe, there is very strong ecological movements, for example, where there is a certain degree of a healthy distrust of authority and of state. So of course, if there are certain dangers, often this mistrust is being hijacked by esoteric, mystical type of groups like Krishna or other type of ideological, religious sects that will enter, and they'll give a more esoteric, more individualist essence to this mistrust. So it was very important that we, people that have a more social mindset, more revolutionary mindset, will engage with such movements, and we will try to nurture this mistrust to a more democratic direction, so that this mistrust will be translated into self-organization, into the creation of institutions of self-management, etc. And as we have seen, for example, in the Kurdish movement, yes, there are certain elements of leadership there still, but nonetheless, all this was not going, in my firm belief, was not going to happen. What we see for so many years now taking place in the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria is that it could not happen if this leadership, this type of vanguardist organizations were not giving space to the self-organization of the people. I mean, this is the backbone of the Zapatista experience or the Rojava experience. It's not that there is someone leading and telling to the people what to do, but actually giving space to local communities, actually taking things into their own hands. And for us back then, and for me and many of my comrades today in Greece, this is a very key element, that we actually create spaces where or strengthen such spaces where local communities can actually debate politics, political issues, create proposals, and not try to teach them what are the correct decisions, but together with them, like the Zapatistas say, to walk by asking. In this sense, it was very important for me personally that I'm very interested of where such popular counterpowers are being created, and how we as organized movements will not influence them, lead them, but help them to develop into a more coherent political alternative to the status quo that we have today. Another element that I have reached to conclusion is the adoption of a ideologized narrative. I have seen that often ideologies as defined by the Situationist International of France tends to be a certain understanding of the world that has remained in a sense frozen into the time, into the temporality where it was initially created. So often anarchists or other left radicals remain kind of hostile or blind to current developments. For example, there was this debate at some point of whether anarchists, autonomists, libertarians should support the Rojava or not, because if you remember, there was this silly dialogues between some very dogmatic people on internet that there was no proletarian subject there, or so on and so on. So one thing that we did, for example, in this social center in Bulgaria, or currently in the collectives that I work with in Greece, is that we are not so much interested in keeping an ideological approach in clearing misunderstanding regarding a certain ideology or not, but actually advancing specific political principles. Because ultimately there will never be a 100% ideologically pure society. Societies on this sense will always be dirty, they will be heterogeneous. What will be at the core of one workable, coherent political system are specific principles by which people can survive. So in this sense, political projects that are based on the direct participation of the absence of centralized power, of the universal equality of all subjects. These are principles that me and some of the collectives that I work with during the years put an emphasis on and try to encourage people into adopting this. Another problem that I have faced, and I was very problematized with it during many years until I made my mind, was the question of power. I think this is a very difficult question, but especially people in anarchist and autonomous circles have a great deal of problem dealing with. And actually, it was the works of Murray Bookchin that helped me a lot, and of Cornelius Castoriadis regarding these issues. So among many in such groups, collectives, etc., around the world, but the same is true for the Balkans, was this understanding of that the what is inherently bad in our societies today is that there are rules and institutions, and somehow we could live in a society without such. This was especially true, for example, for movements in Eastern Europe, where the anarchist and the libertarian scenes were kind of with their roots being cut off by the repressive Stalinist regimes. So they started from ground zero in a way, and they had to catch up very quickly with other movements from the West, for example, that they had their May 68, etc. So there was this like problematic elements that Bookchin himself encountered in North America, in his trips to Spain, etc., where he was seeing this, I remember, graffitis that say that down with institutions, etc. And I remember this very profound text by him from 1999 called Thoughts on Libertarian Municipalism, where he says that the idea that society without institutions is possible, it's a gross fallacy. So he put this idea that the institutions are at the core of every given society. So the question is not to simply get rid of institutions and let some kind of a good-hearted savage like Rousseau would have imagined to run free out of such bonds, but instead to create new institutions which to replace the old ones, and that they will allow for they'll create the spatial environment within which people will be able to exercise power in common, that they'll be able to exercise real equality. So in this sense, a central thing for me was the researching of what kind of institutions can be created, and also what institutions are already being implemented, even in an embryonic state, by certain groups and societies, etc. This was especially true around the Balkans, with the around the time of the movement of the squares, of the indignatus, of the Occupy, etc., where in many squares, in many areas around the Balkans, people experimented with this. For example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there were this movement of the so-called forums, which were a type of local councils, self-organized councils by the people themselves. Unfortunately, such experiments have not lasted long. In Greece is a different case because it has very big movement, and such experiments lasted longer, although with the years the popular participation in such local self-governing structures have been reduced, and actually like die-hard anarchists have remained, and in a sense local instead of real centers of people power. And so one of the this is the one side of the issue, that we should be able to imagine such new institutions, and we should set them forth. We should set them forth as a coherent proposal, but then again, we should also implement this in our own collectives where we work. This was very difficult to achieve in Bulgaria, in the social center that we have created. It was something very new to try to, in a sense, institutionalize the assembly into something that produces decisions that has to be followed by all members of the collective, and not simply produce some works and maybe some people who disagree just don't follow, etc. But we had to find the way that this institution of the local assembly of the collective should play a real role, should be the leading force of our action, and not just random initiatives by different members. So this was a very crucial element for me, because also in Greece there was a lot of fetishism, if you want, of in many groups of what you could say like voluntarism, a kind of chaotic organizing, where simply the assembly was a place where different people come to say what they are preparing to do, and there was no real deliberation of the creation of a common plan from a bottom up there collectively on the assembly. But this has changed with the time, and I think this is something very positive. And the final element that was very problematic to come to terms with was the question of going beyond narrow geopolitical anti-imperialism. So especially for countries of Eastern Europe, there is a deeply rooted this view of seeing the world as a chessboard of superpowers and nation states, and not by one or the other superpower. Unfortunately, there is this feeling is also the good part of the left today. So, for example, when Arabs broke in the Middle East, in North Africa, was still in Bulgaria then. Many comments there expressed our of their struggle to take down dictators. There was a great movement
I think we just lost him, no?
I think so, yes.
That's unfortunate. What do you want to do?
I think we're probably best. We've got about just under 20 minutes left, so hopefully Yavor will be able to join us again in a moment. Maybe if anybody's got any questions for Yavor, they could pop them into the chat for the time being, and then we can pick up on them afterwards. Otherwise, there may be one or two other questions for Felix. I had a question, and I don't know. Did you have a question, Sonia, that you didn't get a chance to ask?
I was actually going to talk about the ethical issues, because what we were talking about was how building dams was damaging to communities and to ecology. But fundamentally, it's an ethical issue. Of course, it's a, sorry, someone's entering the, oh, Yavor's back. You know, it's also about, we have to think about the ethical issue before we think about the ecological issue, because ethics sort of, even though they're both intertwined, the ethics should underline it first, because what we're talking about ultimately when we talk about ethics is how much we're consuming as human beings. There does come a time where you have to consider the fact that you're consuming too much, and it just doesn't exist. And there isn't just a way that we can magic a method that can provide the amount of resources you're consuming without it damaging something or someone. So ethics does underline that foundation, because ultimately it comes under destruction of ecological environments. It comes under demographic change. Forcing demographic change makes you no better than any dictator if we're talking about building small dams or moving demographics just for the purpose of suiting resources. There comes a time when we have to talk to people about the fact that you just can't consume the way that you're consuming and everything's going to be okay. I think also Yavor mentioned how organizing, self-organization in communities was the backbone of any movement. And indeed, he's absolutely right. And indeed, you can't remove institutions, rather you can adapt and change them. In Rojava, you have communities for that purpose, because it brings the power back to the people. Thus, in the future, even if they wanted to remove that power structure that is there in Rojava, if they wanted to remove that, the people just simply wouldn't allow it, because the people have become part of the governance. They've become part of the day-to-day structure. So indeed, Yavor is right. We should be focusing on how to support people in Sri Lanka and India in terms of self-organization. And that's it.
Thank you, Sonia. I can see that you're back with us, Yavor, so I don't know whether you'd like to maybe finish your comments and also perhaps respond to Sonia's point, if you caught that.
Yeah, I heard, and I agree with her commentary. I just wanted to say a final point on anti-imperialism in a more narrow and geopolitical way that is understood today. And it is that ultimately we have to be able to go beyond that, because narrow geopolitical anti-imperialism tends to see the world as a chessboard of nation states and of superpowers, and remains blind to the social movements that work within each and every state. So when, for example, people in Rojava resist, and they do at times, for example, a collaboration with the United States or with Assad. These are strategic decisions, but it's ultimately a fight to retain a functioning alternative democratic system. And it's the same now with Ukraine. Many on the left, for example, in Greece, are extremely critical of Ukrainians because they resist Russia, but they seem unconcerned with NATO, etc. But the thing is that we have to listen to the voices of the grassroots in such experiences, in such countries. We have to listen to those that resist oppression. So when, for example, anarchist collectives or social movements in Ukraine say that they prefer to resist than to be subjugated to Russian rule, because Russia is a very centralized state, more so at least than Ukraine, then we must listen to that. When people from Syria or other Arab countries fight against supposedly a communist or socialist dictator, we have to listen when they say that they don't do it because the CIA told them so, but because they would want to imagine a better society, a freer society. We must listen to that. We must stop thinking into which side we prefer, the West or the big powers of the East. We have to focus on the local movements, on the grassroots, what they have to say. And even if the result is not what the grassroots imagined or wished for, like, for example, was the case of Egypt, this is not ultimately completely in our hand, but we have to support the struggle of those below. And such geopolitical narrow anti-imperialism is an obstacle to that. Instead, we must, I would prefer to think in terms of decolonization, for example. Where it's not just against one imperialism, it's against all imperialism, it's against the inner imperialisms. It's against those who held all the power within within the society itself, of each society. So with this, I would like to conclude, and I see there is a question from Les Levido. From the assemblies that you described, how did they try to create alternative economies and livelihoods? Well, for example, with the case of Bulgaria, have in mind that the social movement, the radical autonomous libertarian movements were very, very small. So we tried back in the time that I was living in Bulgaria, we tried to, through the social center, to open in a way a space for solidarity economy to take place. So we got some products from MST, from Brazil, from the Zapatistas, and then we get in touch with the local producers from Bulgaria. We explain them the conditions on which we would like to work with them, so that is there is a just share of power within these producers, so that we were not working with the producers that had workers, but with the cooperatives or small farmers that worked on their own with their families, for example. So we tried to open such space, and we put a political criteria to the economy, because in my opinion, above all political, above all social spheres, there is the political sphere, because it is the one that determines the rules of life in common. So economy, in the conditions of neoliberal capital, the possibility to consume, etc., above everything. While in a democratic society, it's above all the political dialogue. And this encompasses the economy. So what we will produce, why should we produce it? And then it comes also regarding the question of energy. Yes, energy, but energy from what? For whom? For what purposes? These are all political questions rather than economic or any other. In Greece, the things are a little different. There is a wider solidarity economy network. There is also, maybe some of you know, a self-managed factory, an occupied factory in the Thessaloniki area in central Greece that has been occupied since the movement of the square time, like 2013, if I'm not mistaken, that they have switched production. Actually, they used to produce chemical building materials, and after the occupation by the workers, there was a deliberation in assemblies all over Greece of what should happen with the factory. And there was this agreement that the factory should switch to producing cleaning materials from biological only materials. And this was actually very interesting because the workers of the factory understood that a factory is not just an issue that concerns the workers of this factory. A factory pollutes on a grander scale. A factory produced industrially. Thus, it concerns people on a larger scale. So it's larger than the workers' collective. So the workers of this factory of VMA introduced these consumer assemblies. So there is a place in Athens, there is a place in Thessaloniki, where there is assembly where consumers can go and discuss and can influence the way that the factory produces. And I think this is very profound, because again, shows the limits of like economically centered approach, and instead it advanced like universally political citizenship. A citizen that is ultimately self-governing the economy, the energy, the ecology, the culture, etc. So in Greece, this is much wider, although we must admit it with the time has diminished the scale of this alternative solidarity economy, and also the things have stopped since the pandemic began. And have in mind that in Greece, especially, we had a very harsh response from the Greek state. The Greek state, following a very heavy neoliberal policies and measures since the 2008 crisis, has literally dismantled the public healthcare system. And the only thing that was invested in the public domain was the police and the repressive apparatus. So the state said, we don't have doctors, we don't have emergency rooms, we don't have tools to take care of the sick. So stay at your home. Whoever goes out will be repressed by our huge police forces. And so there were several cases, actually, of riots breaking out around Athens and Greece more broadly because of police beating people who were supposedly outside without permission. And so because of that, a lot of the political activity in the country, of the grassroots political activity, has totally stopped, and now we are trying to recover. But again, since the Ukrainian crisis broke out, the war in Ukraine, the invasion, the movement is once again kind of divided into whether they should support the Russian invasion, or they should support an independence in a way for Ukraine and demand an immediate stop to the war. So this is problematic, and as I said, there is a lot to do with this like old school understanding of anti-imperialism. So in a way, Russia, by many on the left in Bulgaria, but in Greece as well, is seen as some kind of like a anti-imperialist counter force that should balance the world. And it's a kind of, in my opinion, selfish thinking. So let's have a strong Russia in order to balance the world order, so we are somehow out of the conflict could live a better life. I have heard this from Greek leftists by saying that, yes, we know that there was repression in the totalitarian Soviet states and satellites like Bulgaria, for example, or Romania, but ultimately this led to a better life in Greece, which was a kind of a poster child for what a life in the West was in capitalist countries. And because being in a border with a communist country like Bulgaria, life in Greece was actually a much better back then. And after the fall of the Soviet Union and the embedment of countries like Bulgaria and other post-Soviet countries into the new liberal camp. We see that the way of life in Greece has diminished brutally, and Greece now suffers greatly from a decade and more of austerity. So thank you for your time. So let's have a discussion. There were very good comments after the previous one, so I believe now as well there will be a lot of interesting points.
Thank you very much, Yavor. That was great. And so yeah, I'm conscious that we don't have too much time left. But please, people, if anyone has any questions for either Yavor or Felix, that is, for that matter, we can have a collective discussion. Please feel free.
If I can just come in on one point, really appreciating your talk, Yavor, and also at the same time responding to the question that Sarah asked, although she's gone, which was about ethics. I just wanted to make the point that, as you say, it's all political, and COP26, like the solutions were being offered at the moment in UK and other countries about the climate crisis, they are, to me, such a profound scam. And even the environmental NGOs like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, they do some good work, but they're depoliticizing us when they ask us just to reduce our carbon footprint. Because if you compare our individual carbon footprint with the carbon footprint of our wars and our arms industry, you know, one missile sold to Ukraine or one fighter jet, what is the carbon emissions of making and using that compared to where you know, by reducing each of our carbon footprints, we will affect nothing. We have to tackle the arms industry and the corruption and how it's spreading war. So really solidarity with what you're saying, Yavor, but I wanted to give that response to what Sarah was asking. Thank you.
Shall I go?
Please.
That was great, Yavor, and that's really inspirational work. Really fantastic. Thank you very, very much. I mean, I admire greatly what's been going on in both Bulgaria and Greece. I just wondered whether both Felix and you could sort of reflect a bit on what movements in India can learn from the organizing work in Bulgaria and Greece, and likewise what movements in Greece and Bulgaria and elsewhere can learn from the organizing in India. I mean, if the issue is one of challenging power in order to be able to change things, then the issue inevitably is about organizing and how we organize. And I'd just like to sort of get a sense of yeah, things that could be learned from both sets of struggles.
Yavor, you please go first.
Okay, although I'm not that knowledgeable of the struggles that are going on in India, but I would more broadly speak for to give a comparison of what the movements in Greece, in Bulgaria, and more broadly in Europe could learn from indigenous movements. And more specifically, I would speak for the Kurdish movement, is to place less importance on the personal ego. Last year, at the Transnational Institute of Social Ecology, we had a conference dedicated to 100 years of Murray Bookchin, since the birth of Bookchin, and we had speakers from different parts of the world. And there was a person who is currently in the administration in Kamishlo, in Rojava, and he told us something very profound. He's coming from the so-called West. He's coming from a Western country, but currently he lives there. And what he says is that in the deliberation processes there, in the councils, in the assemblies, there is not this desire of each participant proving himself and his position the correct one, proving himself right at any cost, and engaging in endless debates just to prove that the initial one that you say is the correct one. So what he said is that the Kurdish are very modest in this sense. They're very interested into reaching a conclusion that satisfies all the group, that it works for everyone. And in my talks and collaboration with people from other parts of the world where indigenous communities organize, it's somehow similar. There is not this egocentrism. There is a lot of dialogue, and I think this is very important. And this is unfortunately something that in Europe we have went very far away, and especially for countries of Eastern Europe where we had over 40 years of state socialism, of authoritarian communism, and then we have over 30 years of capitalist exploitation. People has become very cynical, and this is yet another problem. People don't believe that things can change, so they have adopted this like individualistic hustle type of mentality. So how could I gain something, even if it's very small, very mild, but just to get by today, because nothing else can change. And this is a huge difference from what, for example, people in Chiapas who live in much worse conditions, in much worse living conditions, who, however, dream big. They dream of new society, not just of getting some more money. They dream of changing the social order, and they dream of a world system change. They're in an open war for decades with some of the biggest superpowers, some small communities in the Mexican highlands, and the same is with the Kurdish movement. They had set to change the world by giving a personal example, and I think this is something that not only in the Balkans but all around Europe and in the West we should take inspiration to think big in this sense, in the political sense, and also to move away from egocentrism. This is what I could think of right now. Felix?
Thank you. Well, I totally concur with what Yavor has said, and the bringing of grassroots voices from India, to answer your question, Nick, of the democratic organizations at the grassroots in India, it's such a complex answer to that. There's many, many, many good initiatives we should hear from, but also in India, there's so many voices within India. They often, I wish people in India would look more to the Kurdish situation and the democratic organization there, which is, you all know, so complex and so well managed in a way. And I wanted to mention too, my colleague Maldika in Ecuador now is right in the heart of the indigenous movement there, and the organization there, it's one of the most amazing I've heard. I think it really compares very well with the Zapatistas, and really up there in terms of both coordination with left traditions, but also with assertions of indigeneity, so that but also just the most amazingly conscious organization. So people rise up through different committees and confederations, they use the term Confederation of Indigenous Peoples there, that is again not exclusive of non-Indigenous, and so on. So as Yavor and all of you have been saying, Estella, so many times, we need to bring these movements, find ways to bring these movements together more and to be more conscious of each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. That sort of brings us to 4 o'clock today, but if anybody does have any other questions at this stage. Estella.
A very brief question. If you're talking about in Greece or in any of the Western countries, if you are talking about movements on the ground, I mean, surely, if we live here in the UK, for example, our problem is, what do we call here local communities? What are the people that you are also involving in the struggle? For example, the trade unions. For example, local workers, you know, in factories. If they are now in a hospital or in any other community, or in local councils and so on. Are there any efforts made, you know, to make such moves also in the Western countries or in, you know, etc.? Just a question. Or have you got any ideas? Or how do you do this in Europe? How do you do this in the UK? Okay. So
I'm
when
sorry,
you're
I
talking,
didn't catch the
for
start.
example, about, you know, there's the Kurdish people here, they have a Kurdish People's Assembly, fine. But they are working on the basis of mobilizing the Kurds in a Kurdish People's Assembly. Unfortunately, the issue doesn't go beyond the Kurds. It does not, unfortunately, and I work with the Kurdish movement, extend to the other communities in the local area. So this is a big question, right? And, you know, you have many communities here in London, your West Indian, other communities. I haven't seen connections being made, other than on a very liberal front of, you know, organizing on a single issue policy. Right? I mean, you have all these organizations like online, they work online or not, you know, assemblies and so on. Okay. But this is within particular liberal political frameworks. It does not go beyond that. Okay. So it's a very important question to ask. I mean, even, you know, in Wales, please, you explain, Felix, you live there. If we can't make the connections here, how can we make them internationally? We live here.
If I may.
Anyway, all right.
I've been
I want to give a brief response, but just for 1 minute, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Do you want to go first, Sonia?
I do actually. I want to say that I've been trying to get in contact with so many communities here in London. Sometimes they seem really interested at the talks and they promise they're going to get in contact, and then no one does. And over the course of the last month, I've been to mosques, I've been talking to the Kashmiri community, I've been talking to the Balochistan community, I've been talking to Pakistani community, and they seem really interested, but then they don't reply to my emails, and then they don't reply to anything that I ever send them.
Well, it's a hard work, Sonia.
Yeah,
hard work. Okay.
It is. But the reason why I'm raising it here is
you are only at the start.
It is.
Okay.
It is. But what I'm saying is, if they do have anyone that they want me to specifically get in contact with, then I would be happy to. That's what I'm saying.
I'm talking about also not just Pakistani and Baloch. I'm talking about the ordinary community, people, workers. All right. Okay. So people who are now on strike, you know, in particular factories locally, actually in Haringey. Okay. All right. Anyway.
I just wanted briefly to come back to you, Estella, saying, you know, your question is profound and there's no easy answer, because I think one of the techniques of capitalism is to divide people.
Absolutely.
And that people fall back on their individual identities. So maybe if a lot of Kurdish people are so bound up in that, they haven't energy to think of another people called Adivasis in India. And similarly with Adivasis in India, they're facing such pressures themselves. They don't see immediately what strength they would gain by learning about another people they've never heard of, called the Kurds in India or the indigenous people in Ecuador.
You have to focus on the area, which I did.
So, I mean, coming back to Wales, for example, the ways in modern society, due to the capitalist and intelligence agency control of the media, we're always being divided against each other. And this is what we need to overcome. And yes, here in Wales, for example, to speak very frankly, I'm a member of Plaid Cymru. I support the Welsh Speaking Initiative, but there is also the Welsh speakers have a certain prejudice against those who don't speak Welsh that comes onto the children. Often, my child is half Indian. He's going to be coming from India and joining me here soon. And he can't go to the schools because you have to have some Welsh speaking there, so he will face some prejudice, not so much for his skin color, maybe, but against the non-Welsh speaking aspect. And yet I'm a Welsh speaker supporter. So, the ways we are divided, that's just one example of the pandemic, the other ways we've been divided over Ukraine, the ways we're divided, as Yavor was saying. It's a really, really deep question, how we respond to this and make community where we are.
Yeah, okay. Yavor?
I would like to comment on that it's really at the heart of the problem of how we should, how we could move from where we are now. And I think it's actually what you describe is exactly the product of capitalism, because capitalism is deeply bureaucratic. While the narrative of capitalism goes to say that it's anti-bureaucratic, it's very individualist, etc., it's actually extremely bureaucratic. It produces uniformity on huge scale. And it also tends to fracture society, the issues of society, the social issues. So you have the labor issue, you have the feminist issue, and you have all the other issues that are supposedly unconnected. And so you have different kind of people go to the streets on feminist issues, and then completely different people will go for labor issues. And this is the problem, because it's the very political architecture that produce all this. Patriarchy is, as Rajan describes in his books, it's one of the most ancient forms of exploitation, and it's arguable that without it, many other forms were not going to appear and have so firm root. So the biggest problem is how we could create this to spread to a more massive scale, this understanding that each of these single issues has a common core. It's exactly the extremely hierarchical, oligarchic nature of of our political systems. And one moment that, in a way, there was a crack in this dominant imaginary was in the movement exactly of the squares of 2010, 2011, 12, with Occupy, with Indignados and all this around the world, where actually people go out in the squares of their cities, and they said that it's the political system, it's broken, representative democracy does not work. We need a direct democracy in order to think collectively of how to solve the economical issues and all the other issues. But of course, this movement fell apart, also thanks to the far right, which proposed much narrower, much simpler solutions that ultimately were completely counter-revolutionary, as always. So I think this is Estrella, a very good point that you put, and I agree with Felix. There is no easy solution, and when we saw how what attack was when societies on global scale tried to tackle it, the square movement. It was attacked by the police, by the far right, and by the whole political and media class. So it's no easy task, and it's unfortunately it requires, in my opinion, a lot of passion and a lot of patience as well.
Yeah,
of everyday mundane grassroots work.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
We've got time. Can I just add something?
Carry on, Nick. Thanks.
I mean, of course, it's a central issue. I mean, and thanks as ever, Stella, for raising it. You always raise it because it is so central. But I mean, of course, and the issue of how do we build a bigger we, so to speak, is going to be a perennial issue in any movement at any time in history, in any serious movement to change things. How do you build a bigger we? And I mean, I don't have an answer to it. I do start from certain premises, though. One is that class doesn't exist out there, nor do communities exist out there. They're made, and they're constantly being made. Class is constantly being made, and it's being made through struggle, and communities are made through struggle, both opportunistically and both positively in doing things and negatively in resisting things, if you like, or positively in resisting things and negatively in not resisting things, whatever way you want. It's made through everyday interactions, and they're not, you know. Yeah. So for me, you know, how do you reach out to communities? How do you build a bigger we is constantly being alert to the cry of injustice, because when the cry of injustice goes up, people are looking for alliances. They're looking for allies to help them out and to understand, not just to come in with banners and so on and so forth, but to come in understanding what is the injustice. So there are loads of different ways that one can collaborate to build a bigger we. You know, I mean, I think a lot of, activists and myself included tend to think, oh, they're not turning up to our meetings. Well, I don't see that as a big problem. I mean, if they're thinking about the same issues and sharing thoughts, whatever way they're doing it, that's equally useful. It's the conversations, the interactions that make for a bigger we. And you know, so it puts an onus on us. It doesn't. It puts an onus not to be receptive and to look out for that cry of injustice, to be prepared to take on other people's issues, not to just say, well, I only work on the Kurdish issue or on self-determination, so to hell with everything else. You know, and it's certainly not about going out and saying, this is my issue, I want you to work on it. So it's a cultural thing. It's a culture of organizing that, as you said, Yavor, I mean, needs to be non-egotistical. And I don't mean that in terms of just individualistic. I mean non-egotistical in sense of your cause as much as anything else. And it's about trying to understand mutual learning as much as mutual organizing in the sense of getting out on the street or whatever. So I'm not particularly, I mean, it's always a frustration, but I don't know any struggle that I've ever been in where it hasn't internationalized, where people haven't made linkages to other movements and learned in the process. I just don't know. I have never been in a struggle where that hasn't happened. Does it always happen when one wants it to happen? No. But it always is there. And the fact that we're having this conversation today is absolutely proof. I mean, many people here I've not met before. I mean, it's absolute proof that, you know, coming together to discuss, to understand issues, to see how we can work together. This is happening all over the place all the time. So I don't despair. I mean, but I do think we need to, you know, to understand that there aren't ready-made political allies out there. They're only going to be made by the process of interaction and struggling together.
100% agree. What's the disagreement?
There isn't a disagreement. I mean, Estella, you and I know we're both on the same page on this. We have been for 20 years. So I'm not suddenly going to go change now. But all I'm saying is I wouldn't get too depressed about it. It's going to be a perennial issue, and it will never go away. I mean, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic.
I even talked to the corner shop people from India, so that's all fine. Okay. Anyway, Yavor, any final thoughts from you on this, or anybody else?
Maybe that's a good place to finish. So some really nice phrases there. Passion, patience, and coming together are probably three nice words to finish with today, I think. Sorry, my connectivity has been absolutely awful, but I've caught fragments of the conversation. Yeah, I mean, thanks Yavor and thanks Felix for two fantastic talks and introductions to those really fruitful discussions this afternoon. I think that's exactly the sorts of things that we want to talk about through this group and to continue. We've identified, I think provisionally, is this right, Estella, for the 2nd of May for a discussion with Rajan de Souza will be joining us, and hopefully, I don't think there's anybody here from Green Trust today, but hopefully we can also bring that group together. And I believe that the 2nd of May was the only day that will be possible. So hopefully that will suit everybody here and other people that would like to join us on that day as well.
Well, I just want to add, this has to be confirmed. Okay.
Okay.
Mother is in Sri Lanka now, and I did actually ask her if she could say this is definitely the date. Okay. So we will let know, you know, we let everybody know, but it's 95%, I would say. Okay.
Splendid, thank you. And Felix, you mentioned, I think you mentioned several books, but you mentioned a PDF in the chat, and also I think you also mentioned the link to a video clip. Yeah, perhaps if you could share that, we could add that to our broader resource list. That would be.
I can't share here, but I'll share it in email to Jeff, Estella, and Connor and Sonia, so they can send it out to the rest of you if that's okay, because I don't have all your emails to hand.
Perfect.
Yeah. But we should add it to our main people and send it out to the whole group. Okay.
Yeah.
So for the next one, also the discussion for the steering group. Yeah. I mean, I think we should add to the resources list and so on. Okay. So just Sonia, can you make sure we have this? Can we do something about that?
Yeah, I'll make sure that we do. Also, just for the future, can anyone who joins these meetings please put their name in their Zoom identity place, because I had someone try to enter the chat under the name of their laptop, which wasn't very helpful.
All right. Yeah.
Point. Yes.
And when can we have maybe the recorded text?
I'll download it. I'm on the way to the because I've got to go to somewhere else. So when I get somewhere that I can send it to you, I'll send it to you. It will be tonight though.
Well, I would say that we could use a bit of an edited version. Yeah, it might need editing, no?
Yes, of course, I can go through it and try and edit it.
Will you be able to do that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try and edit it.
Okay, great. Okay.
Okay, just a couple of other. I think we were a couple of other suggested sessions for the future were something on the agroecology movements in Latin America, which I think you may have suggested previous, Les.
Yes.
If you're still with us, Les, yeah.
Yes.
If that's something that is that something that would you be willing to speak to that, and
Yes.
can you think of other people who would be useful contributors?
Okay, I'll try to think of people who would speak English well enough to do it. So that
Okay.
And it would be good to combine with a talk about agroecology in northeastern Syria.
That would be excellent. Yeah, I mean, I think some of that will come in with the discussion with Green Trust potentially, because but yeah, that would be excellent.
So if you could try to find someone to speak about that.
Yeah.
But any suggestion from Sally, Sarah, if she's still there, or whoever, for the next steering group meeting to discuss, please suggest, okay, either if there are other ideas. Okay.
There was a suggestion from Pinar to talk about ecofeminism, but perhaps leave that until the autumn, when there's the Women Weaving the Future conference. There may be a tie-in with that. But yeah, I'm also thinking, I don't know if Salah's still with us, maybe not, but it feels like there's a discussion about Sudan and Africa more widely would be really helpful as well. Okay, thanks, Nick.
Yeah, we have people there, of course. Mohammed, Jeff might be able to help with that as well. Yeah. Or either you know people. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're probably ready to finish there, unless anybody has any other business or any last minute thoughts.
If I might just jump in quickly, Stephen, before we lost you earlier, before Felix began his presentation, you were just beginning to give an update on the group's platform and the reading list. I don't know if there's anything quickly that's worth sharing now about that.
Might be just worth sharing, and there's not many of us left, either. It might be just worth sharing the email list details in the chat again. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm just going to pop that in there. So we do have an old-fashioned conventional email list, but there's also an online mail-based type list as well. So yeah, it'd be a good idea to sign up for that one to make sure that you get all communications. Lovely. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for me. Okay.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Great stuff. Thank you, Ivor and Felix, and Connor and Steve, and Sonia, of course, and all the rest.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye, Eva. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.